Welcome to another episode of Stories from Science. So I hope you've enjoyed some of the earlier stories we've given. The theme today is going to be tragic heroes. So as much as I would like to make it lighthearted, you know it's going to have an element of tragedy and drama associated with it. So who is my guest today? Well, you are. So I hope you join me today as we go through different stories, and we're going to use the same format. So I will make a statement, and you, my audience, I want you to decide, is it true or is it false? All right? And then as we tell the story, see if you got it right and how many did you get right. So those will be our cues. So with that, I'm going to get started right away. Make sure you've got your cup of tea to sit down and enjoy as we now journey on to Stories from Science on the topic of tragic heroes. All right, so here is my first statement. Your job is to decide if it's true or is it false, okay? So here's the statement. 1600 years ago, a woman taught maths and astronomy to the Roman Empire to a large number of men. What is it you asked that I've said? Let's take it again. 1600 years ago, a woman taught mathematics and astronomy in the Roman Empire to a large number of men in her audience. So think about it. Is it true or is it false? And I want you to get the perspective that the key thing there is 1600 years ago. Well, as many of you may already be familiar, women did not always have the right to education and far more to be teaching in these kind of environment. So that statement, is it true or false? And which story is it alluding to? Meet Hypatia. Hypatia of Alexandria. So she lived about 1600 years ago in the Roman Empire at the time. Her father was a mathematician and astronomer, and having that kind of influence in her home, she was exposed to a lot of mathematics. Being a brilliant woman, she really started to understand it, enjoy it, and became quite adept at mathematics, astronomy, philosophy, and literature. Right? So which direction do you think the story is going? Remember, today is tragic heroes, right? So where does that twist come in? So it turns out that Hypatia taught at what's known as the Neoplatonist school of philosophy, and people came from all over in the Roman Empire to hear her, to learn from her, and she was highly respected. So that statement is, it turns out in that story that I cued you, is actually true, right? And it is very unique because women did not have these opportunities. So was it controversial? Indeed. She was very controversial. It's a time when there was a lot of conflict among religious factions and the pagans. And while she was doing mathematics and astronomy, they accused her of black magic and saying that she was using spells to lure people to her lectures. What do you think? And then the tragic turn in this amazing woman's life and story. In 415 AD, a violent mob attacked her brutally and killed her. And even as I mention this, I feel the emotions and the tragedy of this story, and therefore she lost her life in an extremely violent way. And we lost one of the first women. She's thought of as a feminist hero. Imagine 1600 years ago when you could not even think that women could have this kind of opportunity in science. And that is our first story. So when I said that 1600 years ago that a woman taught mathematics and astronomy to the Roman Empire, to a large number of men, is it true or false? It turns out that it is true. Much, much later, thousands of years later, we have honored her by naming an asteroid after her. And also, if next time you look up at the moon, there's a lunar crater in honor of her, Hypatia. So that's the story of Hypatia of Alexandria. And one of the things that I hope this series does is it's like appetizers, and that I hope it encourages you to go and learn more about these great scientists that we talk about. So, are you ready for another story? Okay, so what is our next story? Remember, so I'm going to actually take it in chronological order. So we started almost, 1600 years ago. So we're going to now come forward in time. And here's your statement to assess if it's true or false. The man who said there were planets beyond our solar system 400 years ago, right? So that's about 1600, which were only discovered recently, a few decades ago, was burnt alive. True? Is that true? Or is it false? Okay, so I repeat the statement. The man who said there were planets beyond our solar system 400 years ago that we've only discovered a few decades ago now was burnt alive. So, who triggers this story? Meet Giordano Bruno. He was a Dominican friar, a philosopher, a mathematician, a poet, and cosmologist, an Italian chap. So in that era, he started to study the ideas, and at that time, they even believed that the Earth was at the center and the sun went around it, which today we know are erroneous ideas. And he was an extremely vocal guy, and he started to say all kinds of things, that there are planets out there at a time when people didn't even know what stars were. So, is that statement true or false? Well, it turns out, and of course there's more to that statement, and that's what we're going to talk about, which goes on to say that he was burnt alive, burnt at the stake. What happened? Because he was very vocal with his ideas, he ran into conflict with the administration of the day, the mainstream thoughts, which were thought to be understood, which were generally very religious in ideology. And they charged him with heresy. So when you're charged with heresy, what does that mean? That means you disagree with the mainstream thoughts. And that can actually lead to a conviction of death. So he was actually jailed for some time, and they said that, Bruno, you need to, in Italian of course, but I don't know Italian, well, not enough indeed. Bruno, you need to recant your beliefs. So he said, okay, I recant my beliefs. And they actually released him. And when he was released, he says, I recant my recantation. Well, if you want to know how to get into trouble, that's the kind of statement you make. Well, it turned out that he kept running from the authorities. He fled to like Venice and to Rome and all over. And at one point, they even falsely accused him of murder, and he kept fleeing. But he could only flee for so long. Finally, he underwent the Inquisition and in Rome, and he was actually burnt alive as an unrepentant heretic in 1600. Remember, today's theme is tragic heroes, and it's all true stories, and it is so important to understand our history. For one, which I often tell my students, that we can appreciate where we are and the freedom of speech that we enjoy. He wanted nothing more than simply the freedom to think and to make philosophy. And for that, he lost his life. I often tell my students, if I lived thousands of years ago, I would have been burnt at the stake I would have been deemed a witch, because that's what was happening at that time. So I hope these stories inspire you, strengthen you to know where we've come from. We stand on the shoulders of men and women who paid a very, very dear price so that I could sit here and talk to you about their stories. So when he was actually charged and convicted, this is the statement that Giordano Bruno said. He said to the judges, "Perhaps your fear in passing judgment on me is greater than mine in receiving it." And that tells you the strength, the courage of these people. They knew what they were risking, and they paid dearly for it, so that we today could have freedom of speech. And in Trinidad and Tobago, I think it's one of the things we can greatly value that we are able to do. And so how was he eventually honored? The honoring comes hundreds of years later. So if ever you go to Italy, go to a place called Campo de Fiero, and there is a statue to Giordano Bruno, right, to honor him for his courage and the science that he philosophized at the time. So there's a plaque on the statue at the end, and on it it says, I'm translating, right, not the original Italian, "To Bruno, from the age he divined, here where the fire burned." So that takes us to the second of our stories today, where we are looking at tragic heroes in stories from science, and the courage of the woman Hypatia of Alexandria and Giordano Bruno in standing up for what they believed was right and moving forward, therefore, the cause of science. Okay, so lots of stories for you to dig further into. Shall we now proceed to story number 3? Okay, so if you're just joining us, know that you are trying to figure out if the statement that I make at the top of the story is it true or is it false. And with that, we begin to examine the story related with it. Okay, so I'll tell you what, this is getting so engaging. Why don't you grab that cup of coffee or tea if you haven't already, and meet me back right after this break. Welcome back to Stories from Science. The episode today is all about tragic heroes. Before the break, we met an amazing lady of astronomy and mathematics. She's actually known as the first astronomer, first female astronomer, and that was Hypatia of Alexandria. After that, we met a gentleman called Giordano Bruno, and we saw his plight and what happened, and that was in Italy. And yes, so we are moving around the world, right? So of course on your map, as we can see, Italy, the boot, we can easily find. And where is Italy gone? Oh, there it is. And Hypatia was of course in the Roman Empire, so those two stories are from this region of the world at that time. Okay, so listen out for your next statement. Women who had babies delivered by midwives died in childbirth more often than the ones who had delivery by doctors. Is this statement true or is it false? What was this statement, you ask? Let's go again. Women who had babies delivered by midwives died in childbirth more often than ones who had delivery by doctors. So do you think that's true or false? Let's find out. And whose story brings up that statement? Meet Ignaz Semmelweis. So he is a Hungarian doctor in the 1800s, and he works in a maternity ward. And in that era, and that's like about what, 200 years ago, there was a very high death rate among women when they gave childbirth. Almost 1 in 5 women, 4 to 5 women would die by what was called childbed fever, a type of an infection that we know about today. And it turned out that he was trying to figure out what's causing this, because one of the things that he noticed was that the ward in which midwives were aiding childbirth, the women died a lot less frequently than the ward in which the medical doctors and students were assisting with childbirth. Aha! So, was it true or false? Okay, so your answer is in that, because that's what he came upon, that more deaths were occurring in the ward where doctors were actually delivering the babies. It sounds counterintuitive. So he began to explore what could possibly be causing this. So where there was midwife deliveries, they would actually be lying on their side, and where they had the doctors doing the delivery, the women would be on their back. So he actually switched all that around to see if that is what was making a difference. It wasn't. And all types of things. Sometimes you had a priest coming around ringing a bell, and he thought was that startling the women and causing them to die? It turned out not. Then one day, it turns out that a colleague of his, after delivering a baby, the doctor died. What happened? But what he was aware of was that the scalpel that he had used, the doctor had actually cut his own hands. And at that point, it occurred to Ignaz Semmelweis that, is there something that's being transmitted? You have to remember, at this time, they didn't know about invisible germs all around us, things that we understand very well. And it turned out that doctors and students of medicine were performing autopsies, and then, believe it or not, which seems self-evident to us today, not washing any hands, running off and delivering babies. And they were actually causing the infection. So was Ignaz Semmelweis considered a hero for coming upon this? And he immediately started to come upon a system that how could we sanitize? He came up with using chlorine, which we know is excellent for sanitizing. Today we know that. And the deaths actually dropped dramatically. He should be hailed a hero. But the episode today is tragic heroes. So where's the turn in this story? It turns out that the doctors were highly offended. Nobody believed him, because they saw it that Ignaz is saying that you, the professional doctors, are causing women to die in childbirth. And they were really, really upset. He ended up losing his job. The strain and the pressures of all of this launched him into a tremendous depression, and he was actually convicted and put into an asylum. And that's the tragedy of some of our heroes. And he was only 47. Some of the stories relate that he was actually beaten by the guards at the asylum. And Ignaz Semmelweis died in an asylum out of an infection that he got from having been beaten up. And it's a really, really tragic story. And he's truly a tragic hero, because it was after he died that people like Lister, yes, of Listerine fame, and others, and ideas of germ theory began to take hold, and people started to see the value of washing hands. That's all he was asking people to do. So he's truly also an unsung hero, and it was not until the 1980s that actually the CDC and the health officials actually made it almost into a sort of a regulation, guidelines about the importance of washing hands for health benefits. All of us, we've just survived couple of years of COVID, and one of the biggest messages coming to us, as you know very well, was about washing hands. And Ignaz Semmelweis lost his life, lost his mental health for preaching that message. So how is he honored? Well, 200 years, and after he died, they've actually named a Hungarian hospital after him, and there are postage stamps that honor him. So they are tragic heroes, but in my personal opinion, it is so important to right the wrong, even if it is long after, and that we recognize where we as humanity have often gone wrong. So I wish today could be a lighter mood, but the topic is tragic heroes. And with that, so that was in about the 1800s, and I'm moving forward in time. So I come to a very, very special story now, and it's still straddling 1800s to early 1900s. And here's the statement. You might need to write this one down. Okay, are you ready for it? The sum of all positive numbers, right? And you're like, oh, wait a minute, is she teaching us mathematics? Oh, mathematics, keep that in mind. Here we go again. The sum of all positive numbers, and we mean like, it's simple. If there are children watching this, they can understand this. 1 plus 2 plus 3 plus 4 plus 5 plus 6, right? All the way up to infinity. What does that equal to? What if I tell you it's, well, my statement is, and this is what you've got to figure out. Let me repeat it. The sum of all positive numbers is equal to minus 1 on 12. Is that true or false? Can we add up all the positive numbers and say it's equal to minus 1 on 12? Okay, so whose story does that cue? Meet Srinivasa Ramanujan. He is, well, clearly the story is about mathematics, isn't it? He is a brilliant mathematician from India. Very religious. He's a Brahmin, and he had no formal training in mathematics. And it was not until he was 15 that he got his hands on a book which had a lot of mathematical proofs and theorems for students to use to study for a very difficult exam at the time. Well, that book changed his life. And he was so engrossed in it that he started to come up with his own theorems and his own proofs. And he did get a scholarship at one time, which he lost because all he could do was mathematics, and he failed the non-mathematical subjects. So he was from a very poor background. You can say a college dropout from a very poor family. So what does he do? He finally got himself a job as a clerk, and he's now just about early 20s. And so one of his bosses understood some mathematics and realized that, wait a minute, there's like some really brilliant stuff this guy is doing. Okay, so folks, if you just joined us, we're talking about Srinivasa Ramanujan from India. So he writes letters. He's encouraged to write to the professors in England, in Cambridge, right? You remember, you know the connection between India and England in those times. And he wrote his first letter, never got a reply. Wrote his second letter, no reply, right? But third time's a charm. The third time, a brilliant mathematician called Hardy actually opened his letter, and people are often accustomed to receiving letters. To be honest, I am a professor of astronomy, and I have had my fair share of where someone will write to me sharing an idea they have in astronomy and just asking for feedback. So here was this letter that Hardy received with 9 pages of mathematical notes in it. So one of the comments that Hardy made was that this must be true, because if they were not true, no one would have had the imagination to invent them. He wrote back to Ramanujan, and in the course of their communications, within a year or so, he invited him up to Cambridge. And it turned out that Ramanujan is one of the most brilliant mathematicians that ever was, I will say, on planet Earth. So as you know, the stories take a little tragic turn. Where does this go? As an interesting fun fact also to know is that in 1985, that's just the other day, they calculated pi to 17 million digits. Yes, right? Lots of idle things you can do. Those of you that you know pi 3.14, etc., 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 it can go on for any number of digits. And they used his equation to do that, right, using computers. One day, Hardy came to visit him and he took a taxi cab. And he said, oh, the taxi cab did not have any interesting number plate. It was just 1729. And Ramanujan looked at him and he said, but that is the sum of 2 cubed numbers, the smallest number that has that sum. And he turned out to be right. That number is now called the Hardy-Ramanujan number, sometimes also known as a taxi cab number. Hardy said he devised a scale from 0 to 100 of the okay mathematicians to the most brilliant. And Hardy, who was, in our understanding, brilliant, put himself at 25, big names at 80, and he said that Srinivasa Ramanujan was 100. Srinivasa Ramanujan went on to become the first fellow of the Royal Society, first Indian fellow of the Royal Society in 1918. And this is where the story takes a sort of a sad turn, that being of the Brahmin caste, he was very strongly observed his practices and was vegetarian and was not accustomed to cooking when he was back in India. He actually began to get very sick and eventually recovered a bit to go back home to India. And within a year, Srinivasa Ramanujan died at the age of 32. And one of the reasons was vitamin deficiency, apart from tuberculosis. He was just 32. So the statement that I made to you earlier, that the sum of all positive numbers is equal to -1 on 12, which doesn't seem to make sense to us, is a proof that he has shown. And this would be the last story that I would take you to. And just know that he has left behind, there are 3 notebooks that mathematicians are still studying, and there are thousands of proofs and theorems that people are still trying to grapple on. So this was the man who knew infinity, and that's the name of the movie that's on his life, and I strongly recommend watching it. It's beautiful, and I will end today's episode with a quotation from him. He said, "An equation has no meaning for me unless it expresses a thought of God." So folks, thank you. And of course, he was from India, so that's the continent we would be on. Thank you very much for joining me on this episode of Stories from Science, and I'll see you next time as we cover another topic and learn about the amazing men and women that have brought us to the present day. Thank you, and bye-bye.